Keep yourself in the loop of everything football on the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast. The latest news on and off the field, be it college football, Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC to the NFL. We've got you covered. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast.
GSMC Football Podcast here on the GSMC Podcast Network. Obviously, you know what we do in this show. We talk about all things football. We're going to talk about Jameis Winston. We're going to talk about Andy Dalton. We're going to talk about also Myles Garrett being reinstated today by the league. We're also going to talk about a couple of moves that potentially could be made around the league, who potentially could go to certain places, certain teams. Obviously, I'm gonna give you my XFL game preview and predictions now that we have football still for the next about 4 or 8 weekends, and breaking down just later in the show where the top quarterbacks could potentially go around the league. So, you want to listen to all that, stay tuned, and, we're gonna have a great show today. So, you know, here on the podcast, you know, we love all quarterbacks because every quarterback has their own unique story. Regardless if we think they're not the best or we think they're absolutely fantastic. And this guy we're gonna start with is one of the pinnacles of up and down, Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston recently got eye surgery to fix his vision, as what I saw was he's always had an issue with nearsightedness. So now he's had that fixed and now his vision is better. So obviously that's brought a lot of jokes. That's brought a lot of people come and be like, oh, so does this mean he's not going to throw as many picks? Is he going to go from 30-30 to 20-20? Like, you know, stuff like that. But, obviously, you know, I mean, you know, it seems little, but you never know. Maybe the reason why he's thrown as many interceptions as he has is his vision. He just can't see that well. And he sees a color that looks like his and like, all right, I'm going to check it down there. And then it ends up not being the right person. So, you never know how these situations could really go or how these situations could really turn out, in my personal opinion, but we'll have to see. I think that obviously Jameis Winston is a guy who has tons of talent. Like, Jameis Winston about him is he's not a bad quarterback where he's like can't really move the ball for you, can't score for you. It's just he makes a lot of mistakes with his pluses. That's why it's like it's how everybody says you don't really know what to call or what to think of Jameis. He's such an up and down guy. You know, he does things right, but he does things wrong. It's kind of a crazy dynamic because he honestly, you see, Jameis is, he's always been someone, even in college, who could always move the ball, make big plays. His first year in college really wasn't too much of an issue. His second year in college was when interceptions started picking up. And, you know, maybe everybody was like, oh, you know, he's just trying to make plays and da-da-da-da. And then he got to the NFL and he kept throwing picks. And it just got worse. And obviously this is obviously the most interceptions he's thrown in a season since he's been in the league this year. And a lot of people like to say maybe Tampa Bay could have been better if he didn't throw half the picks. I mean, Tampa Bay has a lot of offensive talent. We'll discuss later in the show if we think that position, being the quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is the best position potentially in all of the NFL with the talent they have. But the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have a lot of talent. They can run it, they can throw it, they have elite receivers, they have a tight end, they have a good enough offensive line, you know, and they're really an up and coming team if you think about it. They literally look good. And so it's a big question because, you know, people are wondering how do you fix Jameis Winston? They brought in Bruce Arians this past year because Bruce Arians is known as a quarterback whisperer and he had his most interceptions. So obviously that's not really what you were expecting from, you know, that, but at the same time, it could have cost him his job in Tampa. But I feel like Jameis is too talented where you can't just be all out on him either in the league where you're just like, we can't pick him up. Because it's all like everybody says, he threw 30 touchdowns this past year. So if he cut half of that into 15, Tampa's record could have been 3-4 more games better. That's 15 interceptions. That's almost, if you divided that into 5 games, that's 3 less picks a game. Like, if you think about that, you would think Tampa Bay could potentially be a top team. So, I think, he's a free agent, and I think he'll have plenty of people who would want to see about him and want to pick him up. And I think you should. Jameis is a guy who, it just feels like as a team, he has talent. He can get good plays. He can make stuff happen if you give him weapons. But the question is, can you get the picks to be cut in half? That's the question. And that's something that they're going to have to figure out going into the future. That's something that obviously a lot of people wonder about with Jameis. I think Jameis is a great quarterback. In terms of the deep ball, he's a underrated deep ball player. He has, and listen, like I said, with his talent, he'll have options. One team that some people have connected him to is Indianapolis, obviously, since they're looking to upgrade over Jacoby Brissett. And I would think in retrospect, Jacoby Brissett didn't throw interceptions, but he didn't throw touchdowns either. So it was kind of like a Tyrod Taylor. You gonna get about 2-3 picks, maybe 5 picks in a year, but he only gonna give you about 18 touchdowns, which in a way you kind of want your quarterback to at least hit 20 in today's NFL. 25, really, to be an effective quarterback who's productive. And so you obviously saw that in the end of the season with the Colts, where I want to say for about 5 games, he didn't even throw a single touchdown, which is unheard of in today's league. So obviously that's one of the reasons why they're looking into that, making that change. And I think a lot of people would consider Jameis over Jacoby an upgrade. The only thing is, again, can you get him to stop throwing interceptions? Now, like I said, this eye surgery could be a big deal, because if maybe he made some mistakes because he saw something or he didn't see it clearly, like actually couldn't see it clearly, then maybe that could make a difference. Maybe that could make Jameis make less mistakes. Maybe that can put him in a better position. I mean, that's part of it. You really don't know. And I think that's what makes it a very interesting dilemma. Jameis is a guy who, obviously he's been in a couple of off the field incidents, mainly in college. He had a couple of things happen in the league, but obviously nothing that actually hurt him. He's a guy who, Jameis Winston is honestly one of the best leaders in the league. He leads. He can lead. Obviously, you remember his speech back in college talking about we ain't leaving here without a victory. It was one of the greatest speeches ever in college for that program in Florida State. And that's when Florida State was really at their peak, when Jameis was there, making the college football playoff, I believe, 2 years in a row. No, it was the national championship, then the college football playoff the next year, but that was the year that Jameis threw his picks, or the picks started happening. And yeah, because you see the talent, you see the arm talent, you see the leadership. It's just if they can lower the turnovers, then I think everybody's going to be in a much better place with Jameis Winston, and everybody's going to be more ahead of, the curve in terms of thinking that maybe he's not good enough potentially in the league. Like I said, he's a guy who's basically high reward, high risk. And what you're trying to do is lower the risk, but keep the high reward. Because you don't want him to be conservative and then he's not getting the touchdown, even though he's getting less picks, because now you're not getting as much offensive firepower as you could get from Jameis. But obviously you don't want him throwing all those touchdowns knowing, oh yeah, he's going to throw 3 picks, but he's also going to throw 3 interceptions. I used to say during the season that when Jameis Winston comes into town, as a defense, okay, so we about to get how many picks off this man? Like about 2-3 this week? Like Jameis was one of the guys you just expected to get a pick off of every week. It's just everybody trying to figure out who gonna get the picks. And then how many could you actually get off of him? Because he always makes those types of mistakes. So, we'll have to see what happens with Jameis. We'll have to see where he ends up. We'll have to see, does Bruce Arians give him another chance? Which team does give him another chance? because I think Jameis can help a team. It's just about figuring out how can we get this type of good production and then lower the negative production. If you can figure that out for Jameis Winston, you legitimately could have you a franchise quarterback in Jameis Winston. Legitimately. So that's obviously the big challenge for a lot of people. But coming up next on the GSMC Football Podcast, Andy Dalton's in trade talks, potentially getting traded to another team as Cincinnati's looking to move him. And Myles Garrett was reinstated by the league. Was it too soon? My thoughts and all that and more here on the podcast.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we talked about Jameis Winston getting eye surgery and how potentially that might fix some of his interception problems. Also, not too much in depth because I'm going to go more in depth later, but potentially maybe a place he could end up. I mentioned the Colts, and we also talked about just the talent that he has, and just, you know, with Jameis, he has the talent to be a franchise quarterback. It's just, can you get the good production and then lower the negative production? If you can do that, I mean, based off his numbers, why wouldn't he be a franchise quarterback in most cases? That would kind of be the thing with him. So that was what we talked about last segment, but now we're going to get into this segment, and we're going to start with Andy Dalton. The Cincinnati Bengals are now pursuing a trade for Andy Dalton because they don't want him to end up, quote unquote, in a bad spot. So this is interesting to me because, you know, people are going to wonder, how good is the trade market going to be for Andy Dalton? I think Andy Dalton isn't as bad as people think he is. I just think Andy Dalton is a guy, he's like a guy he is an average to decent starting quarterback. If you give him weapons, he can give you numbers, but when it gets to like the crucial times, like the playoffs, we've seen on multiple occasions, he's never been able to pull through. But in terms of regular season, if you needed Andy Dalton to carry half of the season, he's a very serviceable quarterback. He can win you ball games. You know, so I think there's going to be interesting scenarios for him potentially. Obviously, you have the scenario of him starting for a team that may draft a young quarterback and then having him maybe start a year or however long it takes before he has, I guess, a bad stretch and they replace him. I think he would be good for that role because I think it's realistic at this point. Nobody's going to give Andy Dalton a starting job to be their guy long term unless something happens like a Ryan Tannehill effect. But I think that's something that could be pursued. So maybe San Diego potentially, but I feel like that's their last resort. If they like maybe didn't get Brady or Jameis or any of those guys, they would basically be like, okay, yeah, we got to get Andy Dalton. I don't know if they have a deadline for this trade, but I think his trade market really won't pick up till free agency because I think a lot of teams have plans in place for what they're going to try to do with quarterbacks in free agency, since there is a couple out there that people are going to want. And with that being known, it'll be kind of weird for you to go out of your way, go ahead and pick up Andy Dalton, and then, you know, maybe you could have gotten another guy. And so I think that's going to be the interesting scenario here for the Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, you know, it's crazy because the Titans traded for Ryan Tannehill, and they just gave up a pick, and they just wanted a better backup quarterback. And maybe that could be a potential situation. Maybe some team knows their backup quarterback's kind of weak, so they're like, okay, let's improve our backup quarterback situation. Andy Dalton's a guy who could start in this league, so if we pick him up, we have a very high-end backup. That potentially could happen. Now, obviously we'll have to see. I'm sure Dalton wants to still try to be able to have a chance to play. So that will probably be the last resort he will want. But, we'll have to see. I mean, there may be a team out there who's willing to give him a chance to compete against the guy and say, hey, listen, new start. You got some talent. We're going to have you compete against somebody and we'll see what you do. Maybe he could go to Tampa. I mean, we've seen what Jameis has done with talent. He just throws a lot of picks. Andy Dalton has had that type of talent before when he first entered the league and was able to get into the playoffs. So potentially maybe that's a spot he could go. There's been talks maybe if Brady doesn't come back to New England, Bill Belichick would be interested in coaching Andy Dalton. That would obviously be a very big, move, and very interesting, obviously, because a lot of people wonder, well, why would Bill Belichick want to coach a guy like Andy Dalton? Why would he want to have a guy like that who's never really been able to break the seal? So, it's one of those types of things. And, it's something that I think is a very intriguing situation. I think that you're going to have to see what happens because Andy Dalton, I think, is obviously getting his respect by the Cincinnati Bengals by allowing him to pursue a trade. I'm sure it's one of those things where maybe they'll let the agent facilitate it and then the team can just be like, okay. Because I don't think the team's really looking at, we need to get this type of compensation back for Andy Dalton. Because I think this is just one of those moves where you just want to kind of get him off the team and go just take kind of whatever to get him off the team. You'll maybe take like a mid-round draft pick and just be like, okay, here you go. Because also it gets some salary off the books and etc. So for the team who gets him, I mean, like I said, you're getting a pretty solid guy. Andy Dalton is a guy who can come in there, win you games if you need to, be a bridge quarterback for whoever your young player is, potentially compete for a starting job, all of those things, all of the above, really, for Andy Dalton. I remember his nickname when he entered the league was the Red Rifle, because Andy Dalton had some arm talent. He could throw a good deep ball. And now, his time in Cincinnati came into an end as we expect the Cincinnati Bengals to go ahead and draft LSU Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Joe Burrow, and for him to be able to move on in his career, and Dalton finds him something new to do in his last half of his career potentially. So we also got to talk about what happened with the NFL reinstating Myles Garrett. A lot of people initial reactions are it wasn't long enough. They feel like it was a 6-game suspension, which for an offense like that, hitting somebody with a helmet, I think a lot of people felt like it should have been longer. I'm sure Browns fans are like, okay, I'm glad we got him back because now we're having the beginning of next season. I mean, because you got to think about it too. An indefinite suspension isn't just games. Going into the offseason, you cannot participate in OTAs, offseason programming, go to the facility, training camp. So if they reinstated Myles Garrett during next season, he would literally come into camp not even ever working with his team. And he would come in there high and dry. He has enough talent where he could probably get himself back into shape within a few weeks, but it's just one of those things where it's like he won't even have any of the offseason programming. Unless they gave him, obviously, special privileges to work out with the team even though he's suspended. They could have did that, but I don't think he had that. So I think the NFL said, you know what, going into this next year, we're going to let you play. Just don't do it again. I'm sure Myles Garrett, when he went to meet with Roger Goodell, was like, hey, if you do anything like this again, like I'm going to have to put the hammer on you and you're going to be gone for a season, full 16 games, maybe more, no access to the team, and just, obviously like a much worse punishment. So, I mean, we'll have to see what happens. Obviously, Myles Garrett is probably the Browns' best defensive lineman. And so, obviously, I know they're happy to get him back, trying to get this team back on the right track next year, knowing they're going to have their star defensive ends going to really, help them out. It's always weird with these indefinite suspensions because a lot of people feel like the league tells everybody they're indefinitely suspended, because if you try to put a number on it, people may not be happy with the number. 4 games, that's not enough. Indefinitely, you really can't be mad because you don't know when they're going to unsuspend them. I feel like the league just waits until things die down and then they'll be like, okay, we'll reinstate you. Because, like indefinite suspensions there's not a certain timetable. It's more of a, it's basically saying you're suspended till further notice. And like I said, it's just one of those things where there's not a certain timetable. You don't really know how long it's going to be. I mean, some people probably think he should be kicked out of the league. I mean, you have people of that. Some people may feel like, oh, you could have gave him another 4. You should at least keep him out till maybe a certain time, or things like that. So it's really it just really depends on where you stand on the fence with Myles Garrett and what happened last year, obviously with Mason Rudolph. So if you know where you stand and you know what you think should be the case and what shouldn't be the case, then you try to make that case made. And I'm sure when they met, he obviously said some things to Roger Goodell. Myles Garrett did that, made Roger Goodell said, okay, I think we'll reinstate you within the next 48 hours, and that's what they did. So I guess there you go with Myles Garrett. So coming up next, we're going to be talking about some news and notes around the league. The Falcons mulling parting ways with Devontae Freeman. Are the Tampa Bay Bucks the best spot in the NFL for any quarterback? And Trent Williams, the Pro Bowl offensive tackle, talks to Ron Rivera, the head coach of the Redskins, about potentially returning to the team. All that and more here on the podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast here on the GSMC Podcast Network. So last segment we talked about just a couple of notes. We talked about obviously Myles Garrett being reinstated to the league. Roger Goodell deciding to reinstate Myles Garrett 48 hours after meeting with him at NFL headquarters. Obviously Myles Garrett must have gave a convincing case for why he should come back. So obviously, that's a great thing for the Cleveland Browns. Also, Andy Dalton's going to be in trade talks. Cincinnati is going ahead looking for a trade partner for Andy Dalton, so you can add him to this offseason's quarterback market that's going to be out there. If you want Andy Dalton, he'll be available by trade. I don't think Cincinnati's asking for too much. They'll probably just be like, just give us maybe a late round, mid round back pick and we'll be fine. So, we'll see what happens with that situation. But we're going to get into some news and notes around the league now. The Atlanta Falcons are considering mulling over cutting running back Devontae Freeman. Devontae Freeman's entering the last year of his contract. I believe he's owed $13 million this year, but I think he's only a $6.5 million cap hit if they cut him, and they will save $3 million in cap savings. Obviously, Devontae Freeman, ever since signing that big deal, has not been what they've expected. When he signed that big deal under Kyle Shanahan, he had 1,500-yard seasons back-to-back. And then ever since then, he's been injury prone, hurt every other game, missing a lot of games, and just not giving them the same production that they paid for. He's had a very known history of concussions. So that's also been one of the reasons why he's been missing a lot of games the last couple of years. And I think the Falcons, obviously, if you know about their cap situation, they're very tight against the cap. So these are some of the decisions they're having to make because they're trying to free cap space up to try to maybe improve other parts of the team and potentially try to re-sign their biggest offseason priority, Austin Hooper, who has emerged as one of the best tight ends in the NFL. I think the Falcons probably are going to go ahead and do this because I think they just know they have to. I think that even though they don't have another running back that's known on the roster, I think they have 3 running backs that could do the job. Ito Smith, obviously he was hurt at the end of last year. Quandre Allison and Brian Hill. They don't seem like the greatest group of backs, but you might have to go with that committee. It's cheap right now, and that's what you kind of do. You need. Now they maybe have a chance to select a guy like DeAndre Swift in the NFL draft or Jonathan Taylor potentially. That may be something you want to look into. I wouldn't be surprised if they draft one, because to give some competition in there. But you're definitely going to look for a cheaper alternative at running back next year if you're the Falcons, because Devontae Freeman's just not getting it done, and you're paying him too much money, and you're too tight against the cap. And I'm sure there'll be other moves that will be made in that front office on the team to try to free up cap space to create more money to potentially sign other guys. Obviously, as you know, the cap space is also going up this season, off season. So we'll see with this cut potentially being made and other things how effective this will actually be for them. But I think Devontae Freeman at this point in his career, he can still be productive at times. So I definitely think he'll have a market when he gets released. I don't know if he'll be a guy that you'll hear first couple of days of free agency get signed, but maybe closer to training camp, maybe some injuries happen, you could see somebody bringing in Devontae Freeman. Don't look out for the Chargers, potentially. I know it sounds a little weird because they already have a small running back in Austin Eckler, but you don't know. Maybe they're looking for a cheaper alternative at running back, obviously from Melvin Gordon, and they may say, Austin Eckler can be our number 1, and we bring in Devontae Freeman to be their number 2, and then maybe they add another running back and maybe have a 3 running back committee themselves. So we'll have to see what happens there, but that's the news on Devontae Freeman coming out of Atlanta. In other news, I have a question. Which team in the league has 2 all-pro wide receivers, tight ends that are very underutilized but can be one of the better tight ends in the league, halfway decent offensive line, and a good, solid, productive running game? If you guessed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you're right. Tampa Bay is one of the teams in the league who they have a lot of offensive talent. They can score points. It was shown with Jameis Winston this past year. But one of the things that Jameis Winston, one of his issues with the team was sometimes certain players didn't have consistent production. Like Mike Evans, the first 4 weeks, especially in fantasy, did not get really any catches or anything. He was basically nonchalant because Jameis Winston's favorite receiver was Chris Godwin, who became basically a Pro Bowl receiver this past year himself, as he's also been Jameis Winston's favorite target for the last couple of years. Also, O.J. Howard has been very underutilized, which I think will lead to him probably leaving, but they have another tight end in Cameron Brate who's also pretty good. But the reason why I bring this up is, a lot of quarterbacks are going to be looking for good situations this year. Obviously, there's a lot of quarterbacks like Brady, Rivers, Dalton, Jameis, a lot of guys, even Case Keenum, are there looking for jobs. And if you're looking for an offense that already has weapons in place for you to make big plays and have good numbers, Tampa is at the top of that list. Them and San Diego are probably your top 2 offensive overall teams that you would want to go to if you're a quarterback, because they have the weapons all over the field that if you, make the right decisions and don't turn the ball over, I don't see why Tampa couldn't be still one of the best offenses in the NFL next year. I think it's a place that Tom Brady should definitely consider. It's in Florida. NFC, a little different from AFC, but it's in Florida. You have a lot of weapons around you. Bruce Arians is one of the most respected head coaches in the league. I think that it would be a good decision for everybody. If he went there, I think that would be a great decision. And Tampa Bay has an up-and-coming defense, too. They're a team that if they get the right quarterback, I think they know with the team that they've assembled could potentially be a playoff team next year and challenge the New Orleans Saints for the division. So it's all about finding the right quarterback. Tampa Bay has a lot of options. They just have to decide who do they want more than anything. Because they're too good to really draft the top 3 guys, Justin Herbert or Joe Burrow or Tua, unless they were able to trade a bunch of stuff away, which I don't think they want to do. So they're going to have to find their quarterback through either free agency or trade. Obviously, they could bring back Jameis Winston if Bruce Arians thinks he can get Jameis to throw less picks next year. Because obviously after seeing him throw a 30-30 year and their season ending on a pick 6, that probably left a very bad taste in Bruce Arians' mouth and made him kind of sit there and think, yeah, we might definitely have to actually get rid of this guy because we can't have this happening again. We can't have this hurting us again. So I think it's important that that they make the change that are necessary. And if any quarterback in the league wants to find a job, Tampa Bay should be at the top of your list. Phillip Rivers needs to look at Tampa Bay. He moved his family to Florida. He should look at Tampa Bay. Obviously, Tampa, I don't know if they want Phillip. He's basically what Jameis Winston is, but just older. But he's a turnover machine, but he can make production too. But he's also very unathletic. Where Jameis has some athleticism, can move around the pocket. Phillip is kind of more of a standstill guy. So definitely require their offensive line to be really good if they brought in a guy like Phillip. So, maybe potentially, even though nobody talks about it, potentially maybe a Cam. If the Panthers decide to let him go, maybe a Cam Newton. Could they trade for Andy Dalton? Like I said, Andy Dalton has done well with weapons in the past. Again, they may believe in Bruce Arians as the quarterback whisperer and think any guy who can get with Bruce Arians, we think can have one of the better seasons and run this offense effectively like it should be ran. Because like I said, this is going to be a big decision that I think could determine if Bruce Arians is going to be a head coach here for years to come or be out maybe after this year next. It's this quarterback situation, making sure they pick the right quarterback for this team and making sure that they do the things possible to put them in the best position to win at the end of the day. Because like I said, on the offensive side of the ball, they have all the talent in the world to be one of the top offensive teams in the NFL with 2 all-pro receivers, tight end, running game, all of it. So it's something that definitely has to be talked about. I'm sure they'll discuss, and we'll see what moves they actually end up making when it comes to the quarterback position this offseason. And lastly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Trent Williams talking to Ron Rivera. Obviously, if you know about their situation, Trent Williams did not like John Gruden and the coaching staff and the medical staff of the Redskins. Obviously, he chose to sit out the whole year because he was hurt, and they said he wasn't hurt, and it was just a big mess. But recently he's talked to Ron Rivera, and they've had positive conversation. So if the Redskins can acquire their all-pro left tackle back into the lineup, that's obviously going to help Dwayne Haskins, who we think they're going to go forward as the quarterback next year, and give him a guy who can protect his blind side going into the future. Because obviously you don't want your young quarterback running from his life on the blind side. But coming up next, we have more news and notes around the league. Cowboys pushing to get a deal done with Dak. Taysom Hill's hype is continuing to grow. Is he really worth it? And Tua's hip has healed. So now what's next for the Alabama quarterback? All that here and more on the podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we talked about the Falcons potentially parting ways, probably going to part ways with Devontae Freeman, running back of the last 4 to 5 years of the Atlanta Falcons, looking to cut him. The Tampa Bay Bucks, I talked about, are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers quarterback position the best spot to end up for any quarterback potentially out there in the market? You have all the talent in the world. You have all pro receivers, a good tight end, good halfway decent offensive line, good running game. I mean, it feels like everything's in place for you to be, very successful at Tampa Bay, especially with Bruce Arians as your head coach. And I also talked briefly about Trent Williams talking to head coach Ron Rivera about returning to the team, and that would be big for the Washington Redskins, obviously, if they can get their Pro Bowl left tackle back and protect Dwayne Haskins' blind side. But now we're going to get some more news and notes around the league, and we're also going to start with the Cowboys. Obviously, this has been a story all year about Dak Prescott's deal. Obviously, it was reported last week the Cowboys are probably going to franchise Dak Prescott, but obviously that's not going to stop them from trying to work out a deal with Dak. Obviously, Dak has made it very clear he does not want to be franchised. He wants to be signed to a real contract. So obviously, the Cowboys are working very diligently to try to close the gap and work on a deal, to make everybody happy. Some people ask the question of why don't some teams, unless it's just an outrageous amount, why don't some teams just go ahead and give the player the money? Because sometimes the player is going to have a number, and then sometimes teams are going to still eventually get to that number anyway. So why didn't you just give it to him from the start? Obviously, if you know anything about business and negotiations, teams are going to always try to look at, well, we want to sign other people too, so we're going to try to see, is there a way we can work the contract or negotiate the contract or put terms in the contract where we can pay you less, but you're still getting paid enough where you're satisfied? Because almost it's like this. In negotiations, sometimes it may be like, okay, you want $35 million, but the lowest you would go is 33. So maybe a team might be like, okay, well, but a team may think, oh, we only want to give you 31. You know what I'm saying? So you think, well, he's willing to go 33, but the team only wants to give him 31. Obviously, Dak turned down, I think, $32 million during the season, so, because he wanted 35. So obviously, you know, the negotiation is, okay, what can we work out? Is there maybe, can we put incentives in your contract? Is there, you know, is there a way that we can make something, you know, maybe change a salary, maybe front load, back load, stuff like that? Obviously, the biggest thing in NFL, because NFL players' contracts are not fully guaranteed, is guaranteed money. Sometimes a player is willing to take less in terms of an overall less contract if more guaranteed money is being served. Like if they said, okay, we'll give you 132, but we're going to guarantee 100 million of it, Dak may be willing to take something like that because he's getting much more guaranteed money. Where if they're only trying to guarantee him 80, then he may be like, well, if that's the case, then overall, I want this contract to be maybe 135, 160, I mean, not 135, but 135, 130, 136, where he's expecting, you know, obviously more money because he's not getting as much guarantee. And obviously, you know, you believe in yourself as a player and you think, well, I'm still going to be here long term anyway, so I'm not really worried about all of it not potentially getting here. And obviously, how do you work the contract? Do you front load a lot of his guaranteed money? Do you back load a lot of his guaranteed money? All those are things that come into these discussions, but sometimes quarterbacks have that year number. It kind of makes it seem like, honestly, it's more of a, you know, they view themselves as a top quarterback, so they want to be paid as such. We may not look at Dak Prescott as good as a Patrick Mahomes or any of these top quarterbacks in the league, but you have to understand, in this market, in business, an agent's going to always try to get the most money for his player. And the constant issue we have year after year is that there's a quarterback who is good, but he hasn't necessarily done that thing where it's like, okay, yeah, we're going to give you anything you want because you're that good. It's not like Patrick Mahomes where the Chiefs are probably going to give him anything he wants. It's like Dak is good, but there is some questions. How good is he really? How far can he really take us? He's had some bad performances, but he's also had some great performances. And so obviously a lot of those things come into those negotiations of why maybe some teams hesitate to go ahead and pay these players the money that they want to get paid. Obviously, like I said, it's just a part of the negotiations of the league. It makes things obviously, you know, a very tough, you know, decision for any team when you're doing negotiations. So it's one of the things that you just have to really see. You have to really see, and you have to see what happens at the end of the day. So. But in other news, there's been a lot of hype behind Taysom Hill. Obviously, this hype is coming obviously from the report from about a month ago where Jay Glazer reported of Fox Sports that the Saints and Sean Payton really likes Taysom Hill and is looking at him as the next franchise quarterback after Drew Brees. And obviously, there's been some hype behind it because there's been more reports that, you know, Sean Payton secretly is intrigued to see him as his starting quarterback. So maybe there's a part of him that's kind of like, it's almost like in a way with Drew, it's like, yeah, you're great if you come back, but it's not like if you leave, I'm going to be like, oh, I'm scrambling, I'm panicking. It's almost like, well, I feel like I have someone on the roster that I want to work with in that role and I think can be our franchise quarterback after he goes. I think a lot of people obviously question it because it's like, it's Taysom Hill, he's 29. You know, he obviously was in college for a very long time playing at BYU. He's been mainly a gadget player his whole career in the NFL with the Saints. He only has 13 career passes. So a lot of people are like, how can you sit here and say you're willing to put the franchise in his hands and believe he could be a starting quarterback? I've mentioned before on this podcast that I think Sean Payton with his offensive innovations is not going to run the Drew Brees offense that he's going to run with Taysom Hill. I think he knows he's not Drew. You can't just spread it out and say, Drew, light him up, and it's going to happen like that. Doesn't mean he'll never be able to light up a defense, but that's not what you're going to ask him to do on a week-to-week basis. I think their offense, if Taysom Hill did ever take over, would change. I think they would they would probably, I've always said they might make more of a Lamar Jackson type of offense. Because obviously, Taysom can run, he can make plays, he can catch, he can throw, he can run. You could see more maybe of a Cam Newton, Lamar Jackson type offense, which has shown to be successful in the NFL. And the Saints have the talent to do it. You have Alvin Kamara, who's still one of the most dangerous running backs, with Latavius Murray. You have one of the best receivers in the game, Michael Thomas. I think obviously, like I said, a lot of people are unsure about this move if Drew Brees decided not to come back, because it sounds like Sean Payton feels very comfortable with just going ahead and going with Taysom Hill as the starting quarterback. And obviously, like I said, that's something that a lot of people are going to wonder about, because this is a pretty big move also for Sean Payton if that happened, because, obviously there's a lot of scrutiny around it. And if Taysom Hill ends up not being good, it's going to be his job probably, you would think, because people are going to wonder, why would you even think after Drew Brees, a guy who has never even projected to be that great of a quarterback in the league, is now going to be a franchise guy? But it's been shown on multiple occasions, if you can get the right system around certain players, they can be successful. And I think Sean Payton feels like he can get the right system and offense implemented into the team to help with Taysom Hill. That's why I think he wants to know or have a full off season with Taysom as the starter, because he wants to implement that offense. And obviously, if Drew retired like late or something like that, you wouldn't be able to install the right offense that you want to install for Taysom Hill potentially. I mean, people are going to also ask the question of if he's so great, and why didn't you start him instead of Teddy Bridgewater last year? Things like that. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Obviously, Saints fans are going to be on edge, obviously waiting for Drew Brees' decision if he's going to return or not. A lot of people think he will return, but you never know. He might say no, and then he might be a year early on the Taysom Hill era. So we'll have to see that and more. And last, we're going to talk about Tua Tagovailoa, or Tagovailoa. I'm going to have to get used to saying that, but obviously, if you remember him from the college football year, he was out for the year with a hip injury, broke his hip, got surgery, recently has been cleared and said that his hip is fully healthy. But I've also heard that he will not be cleared to actually participate in football activities till the end of the month, which is around the scouting combine. Now, we don't know yet if Tua is going to be at the scouting combine, but if not, obviously he will be probably ready to go for his pro day. Obviously, this is obviously big news for him too, just to make sure he can tell everybody, medical staff, my hip is good, my hip is good, my hip is good, and, just give teams more confidence in drafting him instead of worrying about the hip maybe still lingering with him. So, obviously, Tua is the guy who's probably going to be selected second in the NFL draft behind Joe Burrow. A lot of people think that he is maybe one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL draft. And we'll have to see what happens with Tua when it gets to the draft and who actually ends up selecting him and their plan moving forward with him and going into the future. But coming up next, we're going to talk about XFL game preview and predictions. I'm going to talk about what I think about these coming games, these 4 games coming up this week, and who I think is going to be able to pull out a victory in all of those games right here on the podcast. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment we talked about Tua getting cleared, being healthy, being able to tell teams that he's 100% ready to go from his hip. He might not participate at the scouting combine, but he might. But if not, he'll definitely be at Alabama's pro day, as he proceeds to move forward with trying to give himself a chance at the league. Obviously, Tyson Hill's hype is growing. Could he really be the franchise quarterback of the New Orleans Saints? A lot of people have a jury out on him. A lot of people are unsure about this decision. It appears that Sean Payton seems very intrigued secretly to have him as a starting quarterback, so we'll have to see what happens in New Orleans as the looming decision of Drew Brees' decision if he's going to retire or not looms over this franchise. And also the Cowboys are pushing to get a deal done with Dak, obviously, because you don't want that lingering issue of Dak potentially being unhappy going into the deadline and franchise tag deadline, and then him maybe not showing up to certain camps, especially with the new head coach Mike McCarthy. You don't want that type of start to the regime. Now I'm going to tell y'all about, the games coming up this weekend for the XFL, give you my previews and predictions and why, why you should tune in and who I think's going to win the game. Obviously I'm still learning these teams, but I've watched every game, so I have a good idea. I feel like I'm able to do this. So, we're going to start with the first game. The New York Guardians have the DC Defenders. Matt McGloin is the quarterback for the New York Guardians, as the DC Defenders are at home with quarterback Cardale Jones, as they consider him the face of the league. It'll be 2:00 on ABC. Both teams won their first week game, so they're coming into a matchup undefeated. Obviously, based off what I've seen, the New York Guardians, they look good. They have some talent on there. They have all the potential in the world, I think, to be able to compete with DC. The DC Defenders kind of started slow last week a little bit against Seattle, but they were able to bounce back. Cardale Jones was able to show why, a lot of people look at him as maybe the quarterback in this league potentially that could get the most NFL hype potentially. So, and everything. So, but Matt McGloin played very well last week, and obviously a lot of people were kind of surprised that Matt McGloin has played as well as he has. Remember, everybody in these leagues are fighting for a job. Obviously, the Guardians with Joe Horn Jr. Obviously is the most well-known receiver they have on the roster. The New York Guardians played really a complete game last week, really. Obviously, we know that Aaron Murray-led Rattlers were not really that good, but Tampa Bay Rattlers not that great, but obviously this will be a great matchup, I think, this week for the DC Guardians. Obviously, DC fans are very much behind this team. Obviously, there was a tweet that said that, somebody had made a tweet saying the DC Guardians have annoying fans, and everybody was like, well, the league just started literally an hour ago, so, but, maybe you never know. The Redskins ain't winning, so maybe they feel like, well, if the Guardians are good, not the Guardians, if the Defenders are good, we have a winning team, and maybe that's why. I mean, potentially, they had 17,000 at their game last week. It may be more of a bigger attendance this week, because, obviously the XFL has a good opening weekend, a good hype behind it, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens going into this game. I'm going to go with the DC Defenders. I think Cardale Jones is going to get another win. I think it'll be a good game, though. I think, with the New York Guardians, you really don't know how good they are, because they might have played potentially the worst team in the XFL. We don't know this, obviously, after 1 week, but potentially after what we saw, they had the worst performance. And, obviously the Guardians beat Tampa Bay last week, so playing against a team that people expect to be one of the better teams in the conference, we'll have to see. I think, though, that the Guardians have a very good defensive secondary, and I think Cardale Jones potentially the best quarterback in this entire league. So we're going to have to see what happens, but I'm going with the DC Defenders to pick up the victory and win. Next game we're going to talk about is the Tampa Bay Vipers at the Seattle Dragons. 5:00 game on Fox. This game, obviously, both teams lost last week. Obviously, we know the Tampa Bay Vipers, led by Aaron Murray, lost badly, and now there's some quarterback controversy with those teams. Eric Flowers came in last week and made a couple big plays for him coming off the bench. So a lot of people are wondering if the Vipers are going to go ahead and replace Aaron Murray with Eric Flowers. Obviously, the Seattle Rattlers. Is it the Rattlers? Yes. The Seattle Dragons. You see, I'm still going to use team. The Seattle Dragons obviously lost to the DC Defenders last week, but they did put up a good performance. It wasn't like it was a bad performance. They played well to the end. And, Brandon Silvers, the quarterback, played pretty decent. They have some guys. Austin Pearl, he looked like a pretty good receiver last week. They got some guys. This, I think if you go off again, we only can go off 1 week of football, so I'm going to go with the Seattle Dragons to pick up the win. They were able to compete against the DC Guardians pretty well. I mean, literally until that fumble late in the game wasn't over. They had a chance to come back. So, like I said, based off the two performances, you would feel like that the Dragons look the best going into this game. Now, obviously, if maybe Tampa Bay makes that change at quarterback and Aaron Flowers comes in and plays better, then maybe potentially they could maybe get, I guess you could say, an upset here. But I think a lot of people are going to go with the Dragons. Even though the Dragons are on the road, they are going to Tampa Bay. This is going to be Tampa Bay's home game. And obviously, I think Fox is obviously hoping for a better game, because if they're having this game and then they come out and play a bad game, that's obviously not going to look good for them. So I think that it's going to be important to have, obviously, a better performance overall. But I'm going to go with Seattle in this game. I think they're going to be a pick up victory and, do good things. And honestly, they also have one of the better running games, I think, out of coming what I saw. So if they don't make mistakes and shoot themselves in the foot, I think they should be able to come out with a victory. Obviously, the next game, obviously a big game next week, the Los Angeles Wildcats versus the Dallas Renegades. Obviously, this is going to be on ABC on Sunday, 2 o'clock. Dallas Renegades lost last week. Los Angeles lost last week, so both teams are coming in 0-1. Dallas actually was favored in Vegas to be the best team to win at all this year in the XFL, but obviously losing to the St. Louis Skyhawks really wasn't a great start for them. But Dallas didn't have their starting quarterback last week, Landry Jones. I've heard that he's supposed to be back this week, but we'll have to see if he actually makes it back this week. Obviously, I'm sure Bob Stoops would like to have his team at full strength. And then obviously, it's Dallas, so you don't know. People have these high expectations for Dallas all the time, because I guess Dallas is just a city where you always expect their teams to be good. So, and obviously the Los Angeles Wildcats got lit up last week by the Houston Roughnecks and PJ Walker. So obviously they fired their defensive coordinator earlier this week, and they're hoping to get a better defensive performance out of their defense this week, hopefully, because obviously they were probably at best on paper the worst defense that played last week, and obviously you don't want that mantra of being the worst defense that played, and which is why these changes were made. I'm going to go with the Dallas Renegades to come bounce back this week and get a W. I think that, like I said, if Landry Jones especially comes back, I think they'll have enough firepower to be able to overcome the Wildcats. We don't know what they're going to look like, especially defensively, after last week. We also got to forget Los Angeles didn't have their quarterback last week, and their quarterback was supposed to be Josh Johnson. We don't know if he's going to play. So we could have a game where two quarterbacks who were hurt last week are going to be back this week playing against each other, and maybe that could change the outcome of the game. But we don't know. But we're going to have to go off what we know. And right now, it looks like the Dallas Renegades are probably the best team between these two teams right now. So the St. Louis Battlehawks at the Houston Rednecks are the last game on Sunday at 6 o'clock. Obviously, this is a game of 1-0 teams. St. Louis obviously did not have their starting quarterback last week, but could have their quarterback last week. And the quarterback they had last week did not play bad at all, so if they play well, I expect them to still be able to compete just as well. And obviously, the Houston Roughnecks looked like one of the most dominant teams in the XFL last week, with PJ Walker dominating the Los Angeles Wildcats. Obviously, there's a lot of hype behind PJ now, a guy that some people even said should have maybe won the job, because the last team he was with in the NFL was with the Indianapolis Colts. Some people say he should have won the job over Jacoby Brissett. And, right now, if he continues at this trend, he's going to be an XFL star, which will probably lead to him getting a contract in the NFL. So, we'll have to see what happens with that. But I think that personally, I'm going with Houston. Honestly, I'm not trying to be a homer, but, people are trying to pick, which team you're going to be a favorite of. I'm going to be a fan of the Houston Roughnecks, because I've been keeping up with PJ Walker since Temple, and I've always liked him. And I just think that, obviously, they have some talent. They have some of the better receivers, like Sammy Coates, on the team. And they have other guys that can play really well. They have weapons, and they have everything that you want to potentially be one of the best teams in the XFL, and potentially be there at the end when it gets to the championship. But those are my predictions and predictions. I'm going to go with the Houston Roughnecks to win this game. And coming up next, we're going to talk about breaking down where the top quarterbacks and where they could potentially end up going next NFL season coming around in free agency or by trade, right here on the podcast. You want to stay tuned for that right here.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, I gave you my preview predictions on what's going to happen in the XFL this weekend, who I think is going to win. Obviously, I'm going to tune into all the games, so I can learn more about all these teams, but I have my predictions and my previews for all these games in last segment, so if you missed that, you want to go back in the podcast to watch it, please do. If you want to keep up with all XFL things, we're going to cover it right here, especially also since the NFL, now college is out of it right now. We still have football to talk about, so it's going to be obviously a great time for the next few weeks as long as the XFL is still here, and if they can keep the forward momentum that they've had coming into this season and after last week's opening week. So now we're going to talk about quarterbacks. I'm going to talk about some quarterbacks. We're going to discuss where I think they could go, why I think they could go somewhere, and we're going to go from there. First quarterback is Phillip Rivers. I think Phillip Rivers is obviously an interesting case. He could potentially, end up a lot of places. I mentioned earlier how he moved his family to Florida. Tampa Bay does have a quarterback opening because it does not seem like they'll bring back Jameis Winston. I said I don't know if they make that move, even though I have heard that they have legitimate interest in Phillip Rivers. I think right now, since they're the only team that we've heard right now that has legitimate interest in Phillip Rivers, right now all we can go with is Tampa Bay right now. And so I'll go with Tampa Bay ending up with Phillip Rivers. I just feel like for what they're letting go for him, I'm just like, unless Phillip Rivers is going to have one of his most efficient seasons that he's had and give him a high quality production but less interceptions, you're basically getting another Jameis Winston but just older. And it's just like, is that really what you want? Is that really what you need in this situation? That's kind of the big question. That's kind of the big situation here. If you're Bruce Arians, is are you getting basically what you didn't want before? That's going to be kind of the big question there. So, but I do think right now, since they're the only team that's reported with interest, I think he'll end up right now in Tampa Bay, but we'll have to see. Obviously, another quarterback, not really more for if he's going to leave, but more just is he going to return? Drew Brees. I think Drew Brees is going to return for another year. I feel like it's not like Drew Brees' play is diminished and we think that he can't play. It's just more of does he think it's time just to hang up the boots? Obviously, I've reported about the Taysom Hill situation. Now, there was reports also that they would prefer him come back just to give him another year, Taysom Hill. I think Drew Brees, with this talent, could potentially make one more year at a run. So it just depends. Does he feel like going through the grind, going through the camp, going through the season? And does he believe he could play at a high level and help his team get there? Obviously, after a lot of disappointing playoff losses and exits the last few years, it can weigh on you. It could definitely weigh on you. And we don't know. It could be weighing potentially on Drew. I guess, but everybody thinks right now he is leaning towards coming back. So we'll have to see. So I'm also going to be one of those people who says I think he'll be able to return and come back to the Saints for another year. Another quarterback who's going to be on the market, and a lot of people are going to want him, is the Teddy Bridgewater. I think that Teddy Bridgewater, obviously, after having the season he had, coming in for Drew Brees, leading him to a 5-0 record as a starter, a lot of people were very impressed with how he played, didn't make any mistakes, made good throws, and I think obviously he has a very big market. Obviously, there's a lot of quarterbacks out there. Tampa could be in there, but I already got him going with Phillip Rivers. You really don't hear much about New England. You don't really hear too much about San Diego, even though that could also be a potential destination. The team that you hear him connected to a lot is the Carolina Panthers. I think the Carolina Panthers obviously have a good system around him. If they do decide to move on from Cam Newton, I think that he'll end up there, because I think with Christian McCaffrey as your star running back, I think that you feel as if he has the running game needed, and they have some good receiving weapons there, in a decent offensive line where Teddy could be successful. Obviously, the Saints situation was a perfect example of how if you have a team like that, you can be successful with Teddy Bridgewater. Obviously, the Panthers kind of fell up a little bit defensively, and obviously they lost their best defensive player this past season. But I think if Matt Rule and this offensive staff can get the ship rolling, get this offense going, I don't see why there's any reason why they wouldn't be able to be successful again next year and get back to their winning ways in Carolina. And signing Teddy Bridgewater could be the first step in doing that moving forward. So I think that's obviously something we can't overlook, and we cannot rule out. Another guy is Tom Brady. Obviously, this is one of the bigger ones. You know, it'll be interesting. I mean, one thing Brady's been looking for this whole time, looking for a job, is just appreciation and recognition. Giving him the appreciation he deserves as being the quarterback for as long as he's had. You know, they've said that Kraft's not going to force Belichick to sign him. We've also heard the Patriots are willing to give him what he wants. There's a lot of teams interested. San Diego, obviously. Oakland is, not Oakland anymore. LA is interested. Both LA teams, technically. Not LA. The LA Chargers and the Las Vegas Raiders are interested. He has a lot of, Tampa Bay might try to throw their ring into the hat. There's a lot of teams that want to get Tom Brady. But some people think he'll come back. Some people think he'll do it. It's kind of a very complex situation because you really don't know. Because you feel like, well, he wants them to have better weapons, but if they pay him the money, are they going to be able to? I feel like this is going to be one of those free agent decisions that he won't make really quickly. Some people think that if he doesn't sign with New England before free agency begins, he's kind of made his decision. Because, you know, if you wanted to come back, you'd sign a deal. But Brady said he's going to test free agency. So we're going to have to see. So we're going to have to see what New England does. Teams are going to be waiting for his decision, so you might potentially lose some free agents if you're these teams looking for Brady, because they're going to be waiting on him, because obviously, you know, you're going to have to give him a big chunk of your salary. You don't want to give players certain money and then you got to still pay Brady a big chunk if he decides to go to your team, so that could potentially have maybe a little bit of a Kawhi effect potentially, where you ain't going to miss out on some guys because you're really waiting on one guy to make his decision. I think right now, I think he'll stay in New England. I'm not sure. It's really hard right now at this point. Maybe a month from now, when free agency starts, we'll have more of an insight on what he's going to do, but we'll have to see. Obviously, Jameis Winston is next. Jameis Winston, I think, is in a position where, like I said, he has tons of talent. He just probably needs a fresh start in a new team. And one team I think that can give him that is the Indianapolis Colts. I think the Colts, they have a good system. They have a good culture. They have a good coach. They have one of the best offensive lines in the league. They have Marlon Back at running back, T.Y. Hilton at receiver with some upcoming talent. They have a good defense. Remember, they were thinking they were in position to make a Super Bowl run with Andrew Luck before he abruptly retired, and they had to go with Jacoby Brissett. Obviously, Jacoby Brissett has shown why he is an average NFL starter, but Jameis Winston could potentially be the team that get him over the top potentially. And I think that would be a great place for him to go with the culture they have there. I think that he should definitely look into going there and joining them and making them a better team. I think there is absolutely no reason why he shouldn't end up there. I think it'll work. I think it'll work. And I think Frank Reich, he can get the most out of Jameis and get them in the right position to be successful. I think that they'll be willing to give him the money. And I think, like I said, if he can correct those turnover issues, you feel like you have all the hope in the world that, you know, he'll be successful. So, and then lastly, we're going to talk about Ryan Tannehill. I think Ryan Tannehill will stay with the Titans. I think it's a foregone conclusion. I've read reports, obviously, that the Titans plan on locking him up before free agency starts. People have tried to put Tennessee in certain quarterback markets, but I think Tennessee doesn't want to take that chance of letting him hit the old market, and then somebody else might try to get in and get Tannehill because they're trying to see maybe if they have another chance for another quarterback, and then they're restarting at the quarterback position, or maybe having to go back to Marcus Mariota, which I'm sure they don't want to do. So I think that Tennessee is the best place for him. He showed that he can do something with this offense, and they can be explosive. And the team's season changed when he became the starting quarterback, so I think he deserves to be paid. I don't think it'll be any 5-6 year deal, but maybe like a 2-3 year deal. Pretty good money. 25-30 million a year potentially. We'll have to see. You never know. But I think Tannehill's going to end up staying with the Tennessee Titans and maybe potentially finishing his career there. We'll have to see. But that's all we have for you today on the GSMC Football Podcast. Thank you for tuning in and listening. I'm your host, Brice Lewis. We hope you tune in for the next episode after this. And please don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you and have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.